Hello and welcome to David's Politics Show. Almost 2 years have passed since Russia's full-scale reinvasion of Ukraine in 2022. To take stock of the current military and political situation, I'm delighted to be joined once again by the noted Russia and Ukraine expert, Dr. Andreas Umland, from the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Andreas, it's great to have you back on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, David, for having me. Honored and delighted.
So, Andreas, I'd like to begin by, as we did in fact last year at the 1 year mark, by asking you to just give us a tour d'horizon of where you think we are now, 2 years into this war. Maybe we can start with the military situation on the front line, where you think things stand at the moment. Of course, when we spoke last year, there was still a lot of hope for the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the summer. We now know how that went, but give us your sense of where you think we are now, and then the politics of it all. The politics, of course, in Ukraine itself, to some extent in Russia, and in the West.
I wouldn't comment maybe in detail about the military situation. I'm not enough of an expert on that, and there are better qualified people to do that. For instance, at our Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies, we have a Russian military expert, Alexander Goltz, who has written already a lot of perceptive analyses on this. Mm-hmm. But I think the larger political and strategic context here is that there were two misunderstandings, I think, on the Western and Ukrainian side, stemming from the 2022 developments. The first one, I think, was the idea that Russia is actually weaker than it looked, and the poor performance of Russia in 2022 and the ability of Ukraine to reconquer, or better is to say to liberate again, about half of the territory that Russia had initially conquered, then perhaps led to assumptions about the counteroffensive that turned out to be untrue. In a way, mm-hmm. One could argue that last year Ukraine was, and the West as well, supporting Ukraine. They were fighting the last fight, so to say, the 2022 war. But by 2023, Russia had adapted and then had prepared itself for the counteroffensive, and then was able to prevent this being successful on the land. One has to make this limitation here. On the sea, 2023 has been rather successful for Ukraine. Perhaps most visible with the resumption of Ukrainian exports via the Black Sea without an agreement behind it with Russia, and the creation of a transportation corridor by Ukraine and its Western partners that is now functioning actually apparently very well. The other, I think, big mistake was that we had, for the last 2 years, a continuing discussion about some sort of agreement, negotiations, diplomatic solution that could end the war before Ukraine would gain the upper hand militarily. And we have still this ambivalence basically in all Western societies about the support for Ukraine, and these sort of competing formulations: as long as it takes, as much as it takes, and these sort of concepts that at some point Moscow will come to its mind and then will agree to some sort of deal that for Kiev would be then also acceptable. Mm-hmm. I've just published a longer piece on this in the National Interest, where I outlined the six, as I see them, reasons why such a deal is at least currently not possible, and so I think that was also a big hindrance for the formulation of better policies and implementation, then also of better military support for Ukraine during the last year. And I think now people are actually coming to understand that better. And although it now looks actually politically rather complicated with the support for Ukraine, especially in the US, the experts community and the people who are sort of evaluating that have now, I think, come around in seeing the larger dimension also of this war. And that's why I'm sort of slightly optimistic that we will get new rounds of sanctions and new rounds of deliveries of military hardware and perhaps also more advanced military hardware to Ukraine.
I want to pick up something you mentioned, a very interesting point you mentioned at the beginning about, in a sense, maybe last year, a kind of misunderstanding of the kind of warfare that would be required in 2023 as opposed to 2022. It always strikes me, the similarities between the kind of fighting that we're seeing in Ukraine and also the evolution of the fighting and the Western Front in World War I, which also began as a war of maneuver and also ended up getting bogged down in the attritional fighting that we tend to remember more and that we tend to associate precisely with the middle years, 1916, etc., Verdun, the Somme, etc. But it started out as a war of maneuver and also a war in which the defensive had the upper hand, in which going on the offensive, precisely because you didn't have, at least until the later stages of the war, you didn't have air power, essentially, meant huge artillery barrages, huge casualties, etc. And we're seeing, interestingly, in a weird kind of way, 100 years later, something similar. But looking back now, if we kind of take that analogy, we think, okay, maybe we're at sort of the mid-year point, perhaps in this war. Who knows? But looking back now on those early months and even into the beginning of 2023, do you think it's fair to say at this point that overall the West, and here I mean really primarily obviously the US and Europe, did we do too little, too late?
Yes, absolutely. I think that is also now acknowledged. That is my sort of slight optimism that I mentioned, that at least what I see, for instance, in Germany now, there is a change of mood and a better understanding that the support, if you decide to support Ukraine, has to be more resolute, because if you do it only sort of half-heartedly, then this doesn't make sense.
Right. There's almost no point.
Yeah, it's unstrategic. It's, then in a way one could even, provocatively then argue, then better don't support at all. But this sort of half-hearted support, especially since the countries have actually the weaponry. We see that with the Baltic countries, for instance, that have supported Ukraine in terms of the percentage of their GDPs much more than the West European countries, although since these are Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are small countries, so the overall, in absolute terms, the support is of course not very significant. But these countries have a different strategic calculation here. I've commented on this on Twitter or on X, saying that most of these strategists in the West, in Western Europe, they believe in the existence of two Russias. So there's one Russia that is fighting a war with Ukraine, and then there is another Russia that is threatening them, and that's why they have to keep their weaponry in their countries to defend Russia number two. The Baltic countries believe that there's only one Russia, and what you need is one defeat of this one Russia, and that will make the Baltic countries more secure. And that's why they decide to support Ukraine in this relatively large dimension. Although you would think that they should be the least supportive out of their own security interests, but they have a different strategic vision of their own security interests. I think a more rational one, a less emotional one, and a cooler calculation of what is actually at hand in the Russian-Ukrainian war. To return to your comparison with World War One, I think something that I have not heard so far is the comparison here not only of the course of World War One, but also of the end of World War One, as perhaps in a very abstract, on a high level of generality level way, in that Germany signed the Versailles Treaty, although the German territory was not actually occupied by any of the powers. So Germany experienced a defeat, although Germany was not invaded actually by its enemies. It had its troop on foreign territory, and so that could be perhaps also in a way suggestive to the way in which the Russo-Ukrainian war may end before actually everything is liberated. That then eventually in a treaty that would be to a certain degree imposed on Russia, Russia would go away from all of the get out of all of the Ukrainian territory without having been thrown out by the Ukrainian army, let's say from Crimea. Mm-hmm. So that is also, I think, yet another comparison with World War One. Although in other ways, of course, this comparison does not. It can also mislead the assessment of the current war. It's 100 years ago, so it's sure. it's uncomparable. Yeah. So I mean, one can. Do these comparisons endlessly. Sometimes I'm a bit afraid of these comparisons because they can then they are actually comparing this conflict. Especially here in sort of continental Western Europe, we have these peace and conflict studies that are very much shaped by the study of ethnic conflict, of civil wars, and of basically military confrontations that are not comparable to the Russo-Ukrainian war. So, so for instance, I know only of very little studies of, let's say, Iraq's annexation of Kuwait and then the liberation of Kuwait. That is a reference that is only very rarely, in fact, I've never heard it made here in Germany, where I'm currently. Mm-hmm. But that would be the obvious, to me at least, the most obvious comparison, an annexation that then is reversed by an international coalition. And we have here also an annexation, and what we need is an international coalition to reverse the annexations. But for some reason, most of the comparativists, they do not see the similarity here, and they go into these comparisons with ethnic conflict, civil wars, and I would say uncomparable situations.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a very interesting point you bring up, which is what to do with history, right? How to think with and through history. I think it's essential to have something to think with, as previous examples, because history does tend to rhyme in a certain sense. But of course, that is precisely the difficulty, right? How much weight do you place on these analogies? I want to talk a little bit about how you see, how you would evaluate Europe's overall policy in terms of its support for Ukraine over the past 2 years. I remember when we spoke last year, I was perhaps a bit more critical than you were of Germany, especially. But it seems to me that even though rhetorically the posture really hasn't changed that much, I think even in terms of public support, I think it's pretty much still there on a kind of nominal basis for Ukraine. But in terms of the actual on the ground support for the Ukrainian armed forces and for the Ukrainian state more generally, it seems to me that the EU has been found wanting yet again. The most kind of glaring example of that is the famous / infamous promise to deliver 1 million shells, 155 millimeter shells by March of this year, which the EU hasn't even got close to. It's more like half of that maybe, and supposedly the rest by the end of the year. But in any event, and then there's just to give another kind of factoid on Twitter. I can't bring myself to say X, Andreas, so I'm just going to say Twitter. But on Twitter, Robin Brooks, who's the former chief economist at the IIF, he regularly posts very sort of sardonic tweets about the as he puts it, the glorious history of Georgian or Armenian or Kazakhstani customs, and talks about how mysteriously German, but also Polish and even Baltic countries' exports to these countries went up dramatically, like 1,000%, since 2022. And it's obvious that this stuff is being transshipped to Russia. So it seems to me that the EU hasn't really risen to the kind of world historical challenge of the moment. It's not taking seriously enough what is going on here, which is a fundamental attack on the very fabric of the international order on which the EU itself ultimately depends for its very existence. But tell us how you would evaluate all of that.
Yeah, the odd situation, as I at least perceive it currently here in Germany, that in the discourse among experts, even among politicians, civil society activists, diplomats, and so on, has advanced rather well. And we have now a perception that this here in Germany, that this is a larger war. This is not only about Ukraine. This is about the West, the international system, the European Union, and so on. But somehow this discursive advance has not yet led to strategic and political conclusions that I would think are very obvious to make. And what you mentioned already is exactly what is missing, that we don't have yet sufficient so-called secondary sanctions against non-Russian actors, governmental or business actors that help Russia to circumvent the sanctions, that we have not enough delivery of ammunition and armament to Ukraine, although we have that in Western Europe. The usual argument is we need it for our own defense. We need large land armies to defend ourselves. And my question then is always, but against whom?
Yeah, of course.
Does Germany really need that much defense against France and Poland? And the obvious reasons that we have these large land armies and we have ammunition here and we have the artillery systems here and the missiles and so on is to defend ourselves against Russia. I don't think there's much fear here of a Chinese or Iranian landing operation in Europe that we need to defend ourselves. So but there's already a war in Europe against Russia going on, and there's no reason why we should not, make the weapons that we have do what they were built to do, namely to defeat the Russian army. And the third strategic conclusion that is still missing for me here is, and I may have mentioned that already in a previous interview with you. I've published on this is also that we have our own national interests that are violated in Ukraine, on the territory of Ukraine by Russia. The nuclear power plants need to be protected in Ukraine. That is our own national interest, not to to help the Ukrainians, but to make our own countries safer. There are the missile attacks on Kiev, including the embassy districts of Kiev. We need to protect our own diplomats, our own other representatives, official representatives that we have in Kiev, and we have the technology to do that. We have the air defense systems, and we have a national interest in the protection of, for instance, the grain transportation system.
Right. I was just going to say, yeah.
Yeah. So that is also our interest, because if food prices are high on the world market, that is something that concerns our own national interests in multiple ways. It's not only about prices for food in the supermarket, but it's also about what I would simply call hunger migration from Africa and the Near East to Europe, which is one of the major topics in domestic politics in Europe today. So we have our own interest here to secure Ukraine's export of foodstuff, and we should use our own armies to protect our own national interests, because that's why they exist, these armies. And it's about our own safety, our own security, our own health, our own lives, and there's no reason why we should not use the air forces that we have, the air defense we have, to protect our own national interests. So these conclusions are yet missing. I hope we will get to these three conclusions at some point, that we will impose secondary sanctions, we will give basically more of our own armies to Ukraine, and that we will start defending national interests of Ukraine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's always striking, when you think about, we have all these, I mean, the discussions even last year were going on were just ridiculous, about, well, should we send, the Leopard tanks or the I think it's called the Taurus cruise missiles from Germany, which is kind of the equivalent of the French and British Storm Shadows. And it's like, yeah, well, who else are you going to use these? I mean, are you going to strike Belgium or something? I mean, it was just ludicrous. Andreas, let me ask you a little bit about Ukraine. You're an expert on Ukraine. I'm sure you follow the politics there very closely. The very recent headline was that Zelensky got rid of Zaluzhny, and the kind of reporting on this put a lot of emphasis on the recruiting difficulties in the Ukrainian army, the fact that apparently a lot of the troops that are on the front line are not being rotated out enough, and obviously after a couple of years of very intense combat, the troops are mentally and physically exhausted. But give us your sense of what was behind that decision. I mean, is it really a kind of a disagreement over it seems to me that's too narrow an explanation of what's going on here. It's really just about kind of the inner administration of the armed forces. Was it also the fact that Zaluzhny maybe piped up too much, with that Economist interview he gave a couple of months ago, where he described the war as a stalemate? What's your sense of why Zelensky did what he did in the last couple of weeks?
Well, first of all, I've lived in Ukraine for over 20 years. And if you look on the pre-war history before 2014, large invasion history of Ukraine, and if you follow domestic affairs in Ukraine over the last 30 years, you will not be that surprised about these sort of quarrels within the same political camp, within basically the same leadership. I remember, for instance, the quarrels between Yushchenko and Tymoshenko. Unfortunately, there is a certain trait here in this sort of Ukrainian, slightly anarchic political culture that seems to further such divisions within the same political camp. So it's not only political division between different political camps, but basically within the same political camp. there's a lot of competition and a lot of personalities that do not get along with each other, and then this becomes a political issue. So if you look at, if you see it in this sort of historical context, this fallout between Zelensky and Zaluzhny is not so untypical, actually. The second thing here is that obviously the tension in such times of an existential war against an enemy who is basically engaged in genocide against your nation, obviously the tensions are very high within the political leadership, within also the military leadership. I also suspect that there is much more conflict within the different generals in the Ukrainian military leadership that we get to know of, and also between the political leadership and the military leadership. And this has now led to this dismissal of Zaluzhny, which from the outside, of course, simply looks paradoxical, because Zaluzhny has a very good reputation. He's very popular. He's said to be a good commander, also a good strategist. I also know of military experts who have a very high opinion of him. And the third factor here is apparently that there is some problem with the subordination, and that perhaps Zaluzhny has gone with his appeals to the international community, like in the Economist article, too far, or that he has not sufficiently coordinated that with the political leadership going here by him on his own, and he's a soldier, so he's not a politician, so he's supposed to follow orders of the supreme commander, who is Volodymyr Zelensky as the president. So I don't have any additional information about what is going on in Ukraine's leadership and what the animosities, the concrete animosities are about. But if you see it in this sort of comparative context of this very existential war, in the historical context of traditional Ukrainian disunity within the same political camp, and also against the background of Zaluzhny's forays into international media, it doesn't look that surprising, actually. It's more like something that is almost the rule rather than an exception.
And what about Ukrainian society, to the extent that the one can judge that? Has it maintained its cohesion? Is it starting to fray? What's your sense of that?
Again, there has been always, since Zelensky became president, and also after the start of the large-scale invasion in 2022, a lot of debate in Ukraine and a lot of opposition. The main opposition force is the party of the former president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, the European Solidarity Party, but also other political groupings, intellectuals that were opposed to Zelensky before the large-scale invasion, that criticized him when the large-scale invasion began, and that continue criticizing him today, and now especially in connection with the dismissal of Zaluzhny. So there is intense political debate. Ukraine is a democracy and a pluralistic society, and even though some of the media are sort of captured either by the state or by oligarchs, still in one way or another, not officially anymore, there is pluralism. It's not a monolithic society. I don't think there is real fraction in society. There was never this sort of disunity after the Euromaidan revolution in 2014. Actually, that is an old argument that Putin has unified the Ukrainian nation. The annexation of Crimea already, and then the the start of the covert invasion of eastern Ukraine in April 2014 has then led actually to a consolidation of the Ukrainian nation, also of the political elite that has accelerated since 2022. So I wouldn't talk of fraction here. The debate is intense. Many are very disappointed about the dismissal of Zaluzhny, but I don't think that translates into some sort of fundamental disunity or civil conflict or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's reassuring. Let's move to the U.S., Andreas. So obviously the election is coming up in November. There's a lot of kind of anxious talk about what a second Trump presidency could mean. Just the other day, he I think it was at a rally I think it was in Nevada. I'm not sure, but Trump made this sort of throwaway comment, as he usually does, about the fact that not only would he not defend NATO allies if the NATO allies that don't pay their bills, as he put it, if Russia were to get some other new ideas, but he would actively encourage them to do so. Now, this is very much in the Trumpian style, but obviously it gets people concerned. It seems to me that there are two things one can point out here. First of all, one can criticize the Biden administration for, as we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, ultimately taking a very, very, very cautious approach, really drip feeding a lot of the weapons platforms that we ended up giving them. In the beginning, it was like, oh, we can't give them tanks because that's an escalation. We can't give them ATACMS because they might hit into Russia. We can't give them F-16s because they would come too late, blah, blah, blah. We ended up giving all of that, but late and in insufficient quantities. So there's that. There's the other point, though, which I think is sometimes forgotten, which is that if you look at the course of the last 20, 30 years of U.S. foreign policy, there's been actually a lot of continuity. And it seems to me that something like that could play out again here, even with someone as eccentric and as unusual, let's say, as Trump. But how concerned are you by the possible return of Trump to the White House?
I haven't been to the States. I've lived in the States for a while in California and Massachusetts, but I haven't been for a long time now to the States, and I wouldn't know so much about the domestic politics of it. But I would agree with you that at the end of the day, I think there are larger tendencies and larger continuities that even Trump as president would have to follow, and that he cannot go against these overall moods. As long as, let's say, the support for Ukraine in that population, I think Trump will also have to somehow consider that. So it's actually surprising now that he is sabotaging this help to the degree that he does, because I would think that is all risky for him for the re-election, because then this becomes an election issue, which is very atypical. Actually, in elections, usually domestic affairs play a dominant role, just like taxes and performance, and now also identity issues, immigration, and so on. And now what may happen, actually, if this sabotage, this approach by Trump continues, maybe Ukraine could actually be, the support for Ukraine could become a major topic that I think would damage then re-election chance. So I would think that eventually the Americans will come around. That it reminds me a little bit of this old Winston Churchill, that the Americans will always do the right thing after they've tried all the other. I don't remember it word by word.
Right, after they've done everything else, basically.
Yeah, yes. So I would hope that things will be resolved. This patch will be approved, and even if Trump becomes president, he cannot go against the grain of public opinion. What I'm more worried about, but again, that would be rather something to ask American experts or those who live in the US, is domestic instability in the US that could then simply prevent the US from any larger foreign political activity, because it will be so absorbed by its own problems in Washington and in domestic affairs, if there is high tension, and if Trump then polarizes society to a degree that the US basically becomes unable to act coherently on the international stage. So that is, of course, something that then would be very risky for Europe, for Taiwan, for the other regions and nations of the world. The US basically leaves the international stage and for a while, and then lets the revisionist players to play their games. So this is something that I'm worried about, but maybe this is an overdrawn concern. Maybe the institutions are strong enough in the US to provide stability on the international arena. But I'm worried by this high polarization that we now see in the US.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Andreas, we're coming towards the end. I wanna end with your thoughts on Russia itself, on how this the war is transforming Russia, and in particular, I wanted to ask you about something that caught my attention in the reporting on the Tucker Carlson interview. I didn't actually watch it, but one of the things that apparently Putin mentioned, and which has clearly been on his mind for at least the last couple of years, and you really get the sense when he talks about this stuff that, you know, this is an elderly man who is concerned and is very much aware of the fact that he's dying, right? He's the end is coming for him, and he's very concerned about his place in history and about how much time he has left. And in a curious kind of way, you know, people often say that as you age, you kind of mellow out. But in his case, it's actually the opposite. He's becoming more radical as he's approaching the end, precisely because I think he's very much aware of the fact that time is running out. But he made all these very curious points about the fact that, you know, Ukraine has never really been a real country. It's kind of an invent. It's kind of an artifice of history, partly of the kind of machinations of the Austro-Hungarian general staff. Interestingly, to go back to our World War I point earlier, that, you know, the Austrian-Hungarians kind of tried to invent a Ukrainian identity so that these people wouldn't feel Russian, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's also, of course, Lenin's role in all this, and the end of the Soviet Union. But all this kind of obsession with history. I'm curious what you think about, you know, what effect this is having on Russian society. If we just abstract from Putin as the individual for a moment, because he will eventually leave the stage. But what is this doing to the next generation of young Russians, you know, who are being brought up in this environment where, you know, there's all this talk about all the historical wrongs that Russia suffered and all this land that they need to reconquer, et cetera. I mean, this is straight out of the, you know, early 20th century, but, you know, what is this doing to Russian society as a whole, do you think?
Let me first return to what you mentioned about this historical discourse and the curious emphasis that Putin is making here on history. I think which also by the main commentators in the West, how important history is for Putin, and that the history that he's telling here is basically happening, or that he's talking about, is happening before the foundation of NATO in 1949 and before the Eastern enlargement of NATO, the first Eastern enlargement of NATO in 2004. So that should be noted by people that, whereas in the West, I think the dominant discourse for apologizing for Putin's war is about the most recent history, basically the last 20 years, and NATO Eastern enlargement. The history that Putin is interested is, actually much further away. And one of the bizarre things here is that he's accusing Lenin of creating Ukraine at the same time at which corpse of Lenin is still on the Red Square in Moscow and can be still attended and looked at. Lenin is not on Independence Square in Kiev, as you would expect from his
right. It should be the other way around. Yeah,
from his strange narrative. I mean, this is all so contradictory. So I wonder how serious Russians actually can take this sort of narrative that goes back to the Middle Ages and then tells these stories, and whether they really believe in all this. The strangest aspect here of this interview, which basically repeated argument that Putin has made a couple of years ago in an article for the National Interest, is his accusation of Poland in triggering World War II. This almost apology of Hitler, who had no other choice than to react to the Polish provocations or to implement plans in a military way, because Poland was so uncooperative. So that is, I can't really imagine Russians are buying this, because that sort of apology for Hitler is really strange to me. This is that was already strange a couple of years ago, and now he repeats that again. I wonder how seriously that is taken. The other problem here is, of course, that between the lines, Putin is of course also talking here about his own invasion of Ukraine, and implicitly he is comparing Hitler's invasion against an uncooperative Poland with his own invasion of Ukraine, of an uncooperative Ukraine, and sort of undercuts the whole narrative of denazification and so on, and is actually a self-goal. And I can't really believe that Russians are buying these fairy tales basically about Ukraine. So I haven't been to Russia for the last 10 years, so I wouldn't make here any larger judgments about what Russians really think and why they still support the war. If we believe the polls, for instance, by the Levada Center, is it really because they believe that there's no Ukraine, and the Ukrainian state needs to be destroyed, and there are all these historical reasons why Russia is justified to do that? Maybe that is a major factor here, but it's also bizarre. It all sounds so bizarre that I would think that everybody who is a bit more interested in history should be skeptical about this narrative of Putin.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Andreas, we'll have to leave it there. This has been a terrific discussion and overview of where we stand at the 2-year mark. Hopefully, we won't have to repeat this for many more years in the future. But this has been really, really interesting. I want to tell my listeners once again where they can find you. First of all, the list of your publications is on the website of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and of course, you're also very active on Twitter /X at Umland Andreas is where they can find you there. Andreas, as always, terrific talking to you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks a lot. Very good questions, and I enjoyed that, and will be happy to speak again whenever.